Welcome to the Fenton Forecast. I'm your host, David Fenton. Today we're going to talk about health and the future of health, including how you can take better care of yours, and in so doing, reduce not only your own suffering, but healthcare costs for the country. My guest is the distinguished Dr. Dean Ornish, the professor at University of California, San Francisco. Dean has proven repeatedly, and I do mean proven, in peer-reviewed scientific journals that you can reverse heart disease, you can reverse early-stage prostate cancer, and now he's proving that you can reverse early-stage Alzheimer's by how you eat and how you live. He's the so-called father of lifestyle medicine, and this is real science. Dean is not just some other influencer you come across on Instagram. He's a real doctor, a real scientist, and is revolutionizing medicine. In my opinion, he should win the Nobel Prize. Over to my interview with Dr. Dean Ornish. So, Dean, good to see you.
Good to see you.
The Fenton Forecast is about the future, our choice of futures.
Hence its name.
That's right, at least the second part of the name. And so I wanted to ask you about the future of health and the future of healthcare in this country. And let's say we're in 2050 and we haven't made major changes in how people live and how they eat and what they do to protect and enhance their health. What would it look like in 2050? And then what would it look like if we did make these changes that you've proven and researched? What are we looking at?
Yeah. Well, it's an important question, and I think there's a convergence of forces that the kinds of ideas that I've been advocating for almost 50 years is the right time. And the reason is that the limitations of drugs and surgery are becoming clear. In the case of heart disease, studies of randomized trials have shown that stents and bypass surgery for the vast majority of patients really don't work as well as people once thought. They don't prolong life. They don't prevent heart attacks. In the case of stents in stable patients, in someone in the middle of having a heart attack, that can be life-saving, but the vast majority of people who get these procedures are stable. And they said, well, at least with, they do really reduce angina or chest pain. But they did a study a few years ago, I don't know how they got it through the Human Studies Committee, where they took people who had angina due to heart disease, and they randomly divided them in two groups. In one group, they put stents in, inside the arteries of the heart to kind of squish the blockages. And the other group, they put the catheter all the way up into their heart, but they didn't actually put the stent in. They called it a sham stent. And they found that the reduction in angina was the same in both groups, meaning that the stents really didn't do much. The costs are becoming unsustainable. It's $5 trillion a year now for what we call healthcare, which is predominantly sick care. At the same time that the power of lifestyle medicine, the sorts of things that we've been studying now for 5 decades, is becoming increasingly well documented, both the medical effectiveness and the cost effectiveness. So if we continue down the road that we've been going for the next 30 years or so, I think those trends are only going to worsen. The costs already are unsustainable, and so we'll inevitably end up with some form of rationing otherwise. But if we make those changes now, and to me, awareness is always the first step in healing. And I think that as we become more aware through podcasts like what you're doing, through the kind of research that we're publishing both in the first-tier medical journals as well as in the general public, that we can make different choices. And so that's what I'm hoping that we'll be seeing 30 years from now.
So is it true that the bulk of illness today is chronic disease, and therefore the bulk of cost is chronic disease?
Yeah, at least 85% of the $6 trillion that we spend on healthcare are for chronic diseases that are often preventable and even reversible at a fraction of the costs. And the only side effects are good ones. So my hope is that because of the economic imperative, that it's just not sustainable, that we can start looking at other choices.
Yeah, not only the economic imperative, but all the suffering
Yes.
that people go through that your work shows is not really necessary. So what do you think is mostly contributing to this huge amount of chronic disease in the country? Is it the environment? Is it what people are eating? What causes this problem in your view, according to your research?
Yeah, lifestyle medicine is a field that I help create, which is really talking about addressing the root causes of chronic diseases and other conditions as well. And for many people, they're what we eat, how we respond to stress, how much exercise we get, how much love and support we have, or to reduce it to its essence. One of my favorite quotes is attributed to Albert Einstein, that if you can't explain something simply, you don't understand it well enough. So to reduce these, what I call lifestyle medicine, to its essence, it's eat well, move more, stress less, and love more. So eat well includes food, of course, but also the environment that we're exposed to. Um, Meditation and stress management due to yoga-based approaches can be the stress management, but also includes getting enough sleep, which is when your body and brain detoxify. Exercise includes both the resistance training as well as aerobic. And to love more, people say, I get all this other stuff. What is this love more stuff? And study after study have shown that people who are lonely and depressed and isolated, which I think is really the real epidemic in our culture, with the breakdown of the social networks that used to give people that sense of connection and community, that people who feel that way, lonely and depressed, are 3 to 10 times more likely to get sick and die prematurely from pretty much all causes when compared to those who have a sense of love and connection and community. In part because you're more likely to make unhealthy choices when you're feeling depressed. People, I used to say to people in our studies as I was starting to do them and we'd spend weeks together in retreats, and I'd say, teach me something. Why do you smoke? Why do you overeat? Why do you drink too much? Why do you abuse substances like fentanyl or alcohol? Why do you spend so much time playing video games? Why do you work all the time? These behaviors seem so maladaptive to me. And they look at me, they go, they're not maladaptive. You don't get it. They're very adaptive. They help us get through the day. They help us deal with our suffering, our loneliness, our depression, our isolation. I've had patients say things like, I've got 20 friends in this pack of cigarettes and they're always there for me and nobody else is. You're going to take away my 20 friends? What are you going to give me? Or food fills that void. Or a well-known food writer at the New York Times years ago said, fat coats my nerves and numbs the pain, or alcohol numbs the pain, fentanyl numbs the pain, video games distract ourselves from our pain. So does working all the time. It's more socially acceptable, so it serves the same function. So clearly information is important, but not sufficient to motivate most people to change their behavior. If it were, nobody would smoke. It's not like I'd say, hey, David, did you know smoking is bad for you? You go, gosh, I didn't know that. I'll quit today. It's like it's on every pack of cigarettes. So the information is important, but we have to work at the deeper level. And the deeper level really are ultimately spiritual questions. What brings a sense of meaning and purpose and joy and pleasure in my life? And how can I create a sense of community and love and intimacy? And so I think for me, by spending more time asking those questions can take us to places that are ultimately much more effective.
So it's not just what you eat, it's stress in your life and in modern life.
It's all of that. A spiritual teacher once said, "It's what comes out of your mouth is often more important than what goes into it." It's how we relate to other people, how we learn to love ourselves and other people. Even calling techniques stress management or stress is to really have a much more narrow view of what these techniques really are. I mean, the ancient swamis and rabbis and priests and monks and nuns and other spiritual teachers didn't develop meditation, for example, as a way of managing stress better, or lowering your cholesterol or your blood pressure, or performing better in sports or in business or in school. They can do all those things, but they're almost like side effects. They're really powerful tools for transformation, for quieting down our mind and body to experience more of an inner sense of peace and joy and well-being, and ultimately to realize that those techniques didn't bring us that sense of peace and well-being. That's our natural state. And yet not being mindful of that, so much of our culture, the whole advertising industry says, buy this product, you'll be happy. When you watch an ad for, a beer commercial or anything, really, no one's sitting alone drinking a beer by themselves. It's always with a bunch of people having fun. And so they're really designed to quiet down our mind and body to experience an inner sense of peace and joy and well-being, and to realize that's our natural state. Now, so much of our culture, as we've talked about, says, you're lacking something. If only you had whatever that is, if only you had more money, more power, more sex, more beauty, more accomplishment, whatever it happens to be. If only I had more blank, then I'd be happy. Then I wouldn't feel so stressed. Then people would love me. Then I wouldn't feel so lonely and isolated. Now, my spiritual teacher, Swami years ago, said that once you set up that view of the world, however it turns out, you're generally going to suffer, because until you get it, whatever it is, there's all this stress. We know that the stress comes not just from what we do, but how we react to what we do. But how we react to what we do, in turn, is a function of how we view the world. So if I think, gosh, if only I had more whatever, then I'd be happy. Until I get it, I'm really stressed because now the stakes go up, so the stresses go up. If I don't get it, I'm really stressed. If somebody else gets it, I'm even more stressed. And it kind of reinforces that we think we live in this very hostile, competitive, dog-eat-dog, zero-sum game world that the more you get, the less there is for me, and you better get it while you can and all that stuff. But even if we get it, there's this moment of like, I got it. Now I'm happy. But it
Last
usually
a
doesn't
second.
last. It's soon followed by either now what, it's never enough.
Right.
I had one patient years ago, I still remember, said, I can't even enjoy the view from the mountain I've climbed. I'm already looking over the next one. Or if it's not now what, it's often so what. Big deal. It doesn't really provide that lasting sense of meaning and purpose. I've had another patient said, the letdown that comes from accomplishing a goal is so great. I always make sure I've got, a dozen projects going at the same time. We can all relate to that. Well, that didn't do it, but maybe this will. And so the cycle continues. So what my teacher said is that it's if you continue to search for happiness and health from external things, then ultimately you're going to suffer more. But the goal of all these spiritual practices, including meditation, is so much more than meditation. It's to quiet down our mind and body so we can experience at the end of, say, a meditation, you're feeling more peaceful. And he said, at the end of a meditation, when you're feeling more peaceful, to remind yourself, to literally remind yourself that the meditation didn't bring you that sense of peace. It was already there.
Mhm.
What it did was to temporarily stop us from disturbing what was already there. And so that may sound like semantics and parsing words, but the implications are actually quite profound, because if it's out there, then everybody who has what I think I need to be happy and healthy has power over me. But if it's me, then the question shifts from how can I get what I think I need to be happy and peaceful to how can I stop disturbing what's already there, not to blame myself, but to empower myself. I can do something about that. And then I say, oh, okay, then I can go out in the world and say, okay, I'm not going out in the world to get things that I need to be happy, because I'm already feeling that way. I'm doing that just because that's my dharma, that's my service to the world. That's what brings me a sense of joy to share that with people. And so for me, the ultimate goal of suffering, or purpose of suffering, or finding meaning in suffering, is not that you look for it, but sometimes, there it is to get our attention, to say, okay, it's like when you pick up something hot and you let it go. It's like you don't blame the pot for being hot. You say, oh, not a good place to put my hand. So you say, okay, to the degree that I'm acting in ways that I think I'm going to be getting my health and well-being from outside myself, whether it's personal or social, I'm setting myself up to suffer. But to the degree that I can say, what am I doing to think that I'm getting it from outside myself, as opposed to going within to experience what's already there, then the suffering can be actually a teacher. I've heard people say things like, having a heart attack was the best thing that ever happened to me. And I thought, what, are you crazy? And first time I heard that, I said, no, that's what it took to get my attention, to begin asking these questions, that ultimately my relationships are better. I'm rediscovering inner sources of peace and joy and well-being. I'm learning to forgive myself and others, and have more empathy and compassion for other people. Again, not for some external reward, but that's what frees me from my suffering right here and right now. And the other thing that happens is when you go deeper, when you quiet down your mind, first you experience that sense of inner peace and joy and health that we talked about. But then if you take it even deeper, you can hear your own inner wisdom. We all have our own still small voice within, the voice that speaks very clearly but very quietly, that gets drowned out by the chatter of everyday life. And I've learned to recognize that voice. And in fact, every study that I've done professionally, all the scientific studies I've done were thought impossible at the time. And they all came from listening to that little voice and saying, oh, I think this is going to work. And then kind of reverse engineering a study to see if that's true or not. And whether it's the guru within, the God within, your still small voice within, whatever name you give to it, it's that still small voice that speaks very clearly and very quietly. And so at the end of a meditation, when I can hear that voice better, I'll say hello, and it'll say hello. And I'll say, what am I not paying attention to that I need to? And listen, and it'll tell me. And it's not all at once. It's like in a series of dialogues. And when I do that almost every time I meditate, and I've learned how to recognize that voice, I've I've learned I can hear that voice even when I'm like having this conversation right now or in the midst of busy things. I can kind of just tune into it, and it's an amazing guiding principle.
So, if I may, I don't want people to think that we're only talking about West Coast spiritual practices, as important as they are and as real as
West
they
Coast, they're involved in all spiritual practices.
So, but
Once you get past the rituals that people fight and kill each other.
but what you've proven is not only does this create better peace of mind and spiritual connection, but it affects your health.
Yes.
So I'd like to take you through briefly for people that don't know, which is most people.
Let me just make one more point before I forget,
Sure.
which is the other thing that happens if you go deep enough into that still, quiet place is it gives you a non-dual perspective that on one level we're separate. You know, you're you and I'm me, and we can enjoy having this conversation. But on another level, we're not. We're all interconnected with each other, which to me is the root of compassion, which is really the root of healing. You know, even the word healing comes from the root to make whole. You know, yoga is from the Sanskrit to yoke, to unite, union. These are really old ideas that we're rediscovering. So before we get into the details of the studies we've done and what we showed, I wanted to provide the larger concept of how this all fits together, and that it's more than just an accumulation of disparate elements, but they're really integrated into this common whole.
It's quantum entanglement. There's nothing separate.
Yes, or mirror neurons, or however you want to look at it.
Okay, so, but you know, there are a lot of people online that have all kinds of recommendations, and it gets very confusing for people. But what distinguishes you is that you've done peer-reviewed studies that have been published in major medical journals that prove this again and again. So this is what's really important to know about Dean Ornish, is that he's proven this to the satisfaction of significant parts of even the Western medical establishment. So,
Especially the Western.
that's right, which was no easy task and took you many decades. So let's start with the first studies that you did were about heart disease.
Yes.
So what did you show? What did you find?
Yeah, well, to put this in a larger context before I get into the specifics, I think our unique contribution has been using these very high-tech, expensive, state-of-the-art scientific measures and randomized controlled trials to prove the power of these very simple, low-tech and low-cost interventions, and to show how these same lifestyle changes affect so many of the most common and costly chronic diseases. And the power of science is, the whole point of it is to try to show what works and what doesn't, and for whom and under what circumstances. And there's so many, especially in the lifestyle and especially nutrition, claims that are just made up, you know, that tell people what they want to hear, which is always a good way to sell books, for example, is telling people that, you know, processed fried foods and red meat are good for you, that kind of thing. But they're not, you know, and again, I've also learned that even more than being healthy, people want to feel free and in control. So my approach is not to tell people what to do, but to say, here's what we've learned, here's what we found, and to whatever degree it's beneficial to you, take advantage of that. So I began doing this work long, long ago in a galaxy far, far away. I grew up in Texas, and when I went to medical school at Baylor College of Medicine in Houston, which happened to be the bypass surgery capital of the world. That's where Michael DeBakey and Denton Cooley were the people who basically invented bypass surgery. I actually spent 3 months on Dr. DeBakey's surgical service. And I remember the first day, he said, what year are you, son? I said, I'm starting my 3rd year. He goes, damn, it's going to be so much harder to bust you out of here with all these weird ideas you've got. And he was very old school. He was the kind of guy who would like stick you with a needle if you didn't move your hand fast enough out of the operating field and draw blood, and you'd have to get a hepatitis test. This is
Wow,
AIDS.
that's old school.
Yeah, really. And anyway, somehow I made it through. And in fact, he actually, just to digress a moment, he called me about 4 years ago, after literally 40 years, 50 years, maybe longer actually. And he said, hey, dude, this is Mike DeBakey. And he had a very distinctive Louisiana accent that even after all these years, I immediately had this sense of fear, like, don't hurt me. What have I done wrong? And I said, to what do I owe this honor? He goes, oh, you know those weird ideas I used to give you such a hard time about when you were my medical student? I said, yeah, I remember really well. He goes, that's what's kept me alive all these years. He says, I'm 99 years old. I'll probably be dead soon. I just thought you'd like to know that my wife got interested in your work and it really helped me. And hung up. It's like, and I said, wow, if you live long enough, things going to come full circle. But anyway, at the time, we would cut people open, we bypass their clogged arteries. He'd tell them they were cured. And more often than not, they would go home and do all the things that had caused the problem in the first place. Eat junk food, not manage stress, smoke cigarettes, not exercise. And more often than not, the new bypasses would clog up. Kind of like, mopping. I had a cartoon drawn years ago of doctors busily mopping up the floor around a sink that's overflowing, but nobody's turning off the faucet or changing the oil filter in your car without changing the oil. The next one's just going to clog up again. So I thought there's got to be a better way. And so I went to this thing they used to have. You probably remember them, called libraries, and they had these square things called journals, that were paper.
Microfilm.
And no, not microfilm, actually real journals. Sometimes the pages were ripped out, but most of the time they were there, and they had these things for 10 cents. You could make copies of the pages. And so I spent a lot of time in the library and got a little obsessed with this idea that, in dogs and cats and pigs and rabbits and monkeys, you could cause them to get heart disease if you put them on a typical American diet and put them under emotional stress and made them smoke and didn't let them exercise and kept them isolated. And you could reverse it if you changed all those things. And so why should people be any different? And one of the nice things about being a second-year medical student is you're not fully indoctrinated.
Right.
So you kind of see things like that are obvious to you at the time that kind of get indoctrinated out of you later on. And they say, well, people are just different. So the nice thing about going to medical school in Texas is Baylor had this very pioneering ethos. You've got this weird idea, go for it. You learn something and we'll support it. So the chief of medicine, Tony Gatto, said he'd support it. And the chief of cardiology, Richard Miller, referred patients. And I went to every hotel in Houston. The last one I went to, the Plaza Hotel, donated 10 rooms to me for a month.
This is why you're in medical school.
Well, yeah, I took much to my parents' dismay. I took a year off between my second and third years of medical school to do this because they were convinced I'd never go back. But actually, ironically, it helped my career more than anything. And I did everything. I taught the classes. I ran the support groups. I did everything other than cook the meals. And then after a month, we used a test that was brand new at the time called thallium scintigraphy that measures blood flow to the heart. And we found that, first of all, the chest pain went away in almost all these people. These are people who had really bad heart disease, who were considered too sick for a bypass. Back then, almost anybody could be operated on. They had blockages throughout their arteries, so they didn't really have anything to bypass. Anyway, and 80% of the patients became pain-free in just 30 days, which was unheard of. But they not only felt better, in most cases, they were better in ways we could measure. The blood flow to the heart improved. Now, I showed these to the people that I was working with, the heads of cardiology, and they said, oh, that's impossible. I said, what do you mean it's impossible? These are your tests. You did the tests. These are the same tests we send people to bypass surgery every day. Why are they suddenly not working? Well, it's just not possible. Something must be wrong. Well, you didn't control for the time of day you tested people. I said, who does that? Well, you didn't have a randomized control group for comparison. How do you know they wouldn't have gotten better anyway? Well, technically that's true, but how often do you see patients getting better anyway? Oh, that's beside the point, So I went back to school. We published it, published the abstract of it anyway. Went back to school, finished medical school, then took another year off before starting my internship to do a second study. And this time we did have a randomized control group for comparison.
A group that wasn't on your program.
Yeah, well, these are people who all have bad heart disease. Half of them you randomly give the program to, and half of them you don't. And with any randomized trial, the reason the randomized trials are powerful is that if there are any factors that are influencing your outcome that you're not aware of, there's likely to affect one group as the other, like maybe the water supply or the air, or who knows what.
Yeah, right.
So we found that using a test which measured how well the heart was pumping blood, it improved in one group, it got worse in the other group. We scientifically picked 24 days as the intervention time because the hotel said we could use it for free for 24 days. We put them out in the middle of the hill country in Austin. We found in the first study, people were going down to the bar and having pepperoni pizza and drove them. So we put them in a more secluded environment. And we published it in the Journal of the American Medical Association. And
what year was that?
That was in 1998.
Okay.
Yeah, we published in that. And then
and what was the reaction?
I'm sorry, that was, let's see, I went to, yeah, it was in 98. It was, it was controversial, but Tony Gatto, the chief of medicine at Baylor, had trained at Mass General in Boston. And he said that the current head of the medical services there and the chief of medicine at Harvard, Alexander Leaf, was interested in this kind of stuff. And so I called him up. I said, hey, you want to come down and see what we're doing? And he did. And he later said he was so tickled that this lowly medical student had the gumption to call the god of medicine at Harvard and invite him to come, that he decided to come and see who this weird guy was. And he heard the stories of the patients getting better. And then he invited me to give medical grand rounds there at Mass General, which I said, sure, I'm happy to do that. And Tony Gatto was chief of medicine. He knew, he said, no, that's never been done before. It's always done by a professor. No medical student has done that. And I don't want you to go. You'll embarrass me. And I said, well, I don't embarrass you. Let me give grand rounds at Baylor. And if I do well, give me your blessing. And if not, I won't go. And so I did well. And he gave me his blessing. That's how I ended up doing my internship and residency at Mass General in internal medicine. And after 3 years of that, moved to San Francisco and began the third study, the most definitive, called the lifestyle
Heart study.
of the cardiac. That's right. And this used the state-of-the-art measures. We used quantitative coronary arteriography to measure the amount of blockage in the coronary arteries, and cardiac PET scans, positron emission tomography, to measure blood flow. It turned out there were only 2 cardiac PET scanners in the country at that time. The best one was in Houston at the University of Texas. So we actually worked with what was then Continental Airlines. Frank Lorenzo was the CEO, and he donated the airfare so we could actually fly our patients to Houston and back for this special test. And then after 1 year, we found that the arteries got more clogged in the usual care group, which is what usually happens, but less clogged in the group that made these lifestyle changes. And that was the first study showing that any intervention could actually reverse the blockages in the arteries, at least to a measurable degree. We published that in The Lancet, which is the leading international peer-reviewed medical journal. And based on those findings, we were able to get funding from the National Institutes of Health to extend the study for 4 more years, for a total of 5 years. And we found that after 5 years, there was even more blockage in the usual care group.
But I mean the people not on
the
your
people
program.
not on the program,
Right.
That's right. But the people who went on the program showed some less clogging after 1 year and even less clogging after 5 years.
If they stuck with the program.
Well, on average, we have to, when you do a randomized trial, you have to measure everybody, even
Right.
if they don't stick with it. Oh, it's called the intention to treat.
Sure.
But on average, that's what we found. If we limited it to the people, we did find, as we have subsequently found in all of our studies, using a priori formula that took into account all the 4 aspects of the lifestyle program, that the more you change, the more you improve. There was a dose-response correlation between the degree of lifestyle change and the degree of improvement in whatever we measured, in this case, in the amount of blockage in the coronary arteries. We also found with the PET scans that 99% of the patients stopped to reverse the progression of their heart disease, whereas only 5% of the usual care group showed improvement. We published that as a separate paper in the Journal of the American Medical Association. So that got my interest. We also find there were 2.5 times more cardiac events, heart attacks, strokes, bypasses, angioplasties, and stents in the usual care group compared to
In the business as usual, eat as usual,
That's right.
act as usual group.
So that was tremendously fulfilling. And that was very controversial at the time, again, because no study had shown that anything. At the time, people viewed heart disease then the way they tend to view Alzheimer's today, which is that once you have it, the best you could do was slow down the rate at which it got worse. But we found that if you make a lot of changes at the same time and you make much bigger changes, that many people could stop or reverse its progression.
Okay, let's go through some of the other studies a little bit more quickly. That's a great basis for people to understand how you prove this. So, as I understand it, next you started showing that your genes are not your destiny, that you can change genetic expression depending on how you live, how you eat, how you exercise, how you deal with stress. Is that right?
Yeah, it wasn't the next study we did, but we did that subsequently. And we found that, so often people say, oh, I've just got bad genes. There's nothing I can do, right? But it turns out, again, not to blame, but to empower people, that our genes are not, in most cases, our destiny or not our fate, that there are proteins that turn on and turn off these genes. They're called sirtuins, or they're histone or non-histone proteins, or methylation, that act like switches. And so if you can turn off a protein, a gene that regulates, say, inflammation, it's as though you changed your genes functionally. And so one of the things that my wife Ann and I wrote about in our book Undo It, which came out a few years ago, was this unifying hypothesis that why is it that these same lifestyle changes can stop and even reverse the progression of so many different diseases. I was taught in medical school, every disease is different diseases, different diagnoses, different treatments. But it turns out these same lifestyle changes, a whole foods plant-based diet that's low in fat and sugar and processed foods, meditation and yoga-based stress management, enough sleep, exercise, both resistance training and aerobic, and love and support, could impact all these different conditions? And the answer is because they're really not so different. They all share many of the same underlying biological mechanisms. And they include things like chronic inflammation, oxidative stress, changes in the microbiome, the 100 trillion cells that live in our gut, overstimulation of the sympathetic nervous system during times of stress, angiogenesis, apoptosis, changes in immune function, and so on, that are turned on or turned off by what we eat, how we respond to stress, how much exercise we get, and how much love and social support we have, which then in turn affect all these different conditions. And so it's a radically simplifying approach, that it's not like here's your diet for heart disease, and here's your one for type 2 diabetes, and here's your one for Alzheimer's, and here's your one for prostate cancer. It's really the same diet and lifestyle interventions.
So anti-reductionist medicine.
Well, it's like that wonderful quote from Albert Einstein: if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. It's about really trying to see what's in common, that the more I learn about something, the more I can simplify it.
Okay, so you showed it for heart disease. You showed it on genetic.
Well, let me just add one more thing.
Okay.
So when we did the study with Craig Venter, we found that over 500 genes were affected in just 3 months.
This was the genetic study.
The genetic study. So when we did the study with Craig Venter, we found that over 501 genes to be exact, were turned on or turned off when people made these same lifestyle changes. And it turned out that another group of scientists studied our program. They found that the genes that were turned off were the ones that regulate these underlying biological mechanisms that are common to all these different conditions. So like chronic inflammation, oxidative stress, and so on. We actually measure that inflammation goes down and stress levels go down and so on. So it helped provide a biological plausible mechanism of why these same lifestyle changes can affect so many of the most common and costly chronic diseases.
And it also, didn't you find that the telomerase length changed, which is linked to longevity? You want to explain that?
It also explains why these biological mechanisms are much more dynamic. You can get better quickly, you can get worse quickly. And why these studies are showing that, for example, we did a study with Elizabeth Blackburn, who got the Nobel Prize for her co-discovery of telomerase, which is the enzyme that repairs and lengthens telomeres, which are the ends of our chromosomes that regulate cellular aging. They're sometimes compared to the plastic tips at the end of a shoelace that keep our shoelace from unraveling. They actually keep our DNA from unraveling. And so when your DNA replicates over time, the telomeres start to get shorter. And as she found that as our telomeres get shorter, our lives get shorter, and the risk of all these different chronic diseases, again, heart disease, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, prostate cancer, Alzheimer's disease, et cetera, as your telomeres get shorter, the risk of all these diseases goes up proportionate to that. And she had done some wonderful studies with Alyssa Apple where they found that women under chronic stress, because they had kids with autism, for example, their telomeres got shorter faster. Or people who smoked cigarettes, their telomeres got shorter faster, or who were sedentary, who ate junk food, and so on. So we had lunch one day, and I said, if bad things make your telomeres shorter, maybe good things make them longer. And one of the great things about working with a world-class scientist like that is instead of going, oh, that's a dumb idea, that'll never happen, she goes, let's find out. So we did a study, and we found that in just 3 months, the telomerase that repairs and lengthens telomeres increased by 30% in the people who made these changes compared to those who didn't. And over a 5-year period, we found they actually got longer, which was the first study showing that any intervention, including pharma, could actually lengthen telomeres, whereas they got shorter in the usual care comparison group. We published both of those studies in the Lancet Oncology, and the Lancet editor sent out a press release calling it the first study showing that lifestyle changes may reduce aging at a cellular level. And, there's so much interest in longevity these days. And as I'm getting older, I'm interested too. But I find it, really encouraging. In fact, just a few days ago, this company called Vero asked to do a blood test on me to measure my biological age using these sophisticated proteomic measures that Tony Wiscore did at Stanford. And they said that my biological age is 24 years younger than my chronological age, which is always reassuring.
Not bad. So tell us about your prostate cancer and Alzheimer's studies.
Yeah, so we did a study with prostate cancer with Peter Carroll, who's the chair of urology at UCSF, where I'm a professor. And Bill Fair, when he at the time was the chair of urology and urologic oncology at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York. When you're doing disruptive studies, it's always good to work with people who are the leaders in the field because they're easier to get published and people tend to believe it. And I always learned so much by working with people like that. And so we took men who had early stage prostate cancer and had decided for reasons unrelated to the study not to undergo conventional treatment, surgery, radiation, chemotherapy, and so on. And you might say, why would somebody who knows they have prostate cancer not get treated right away? And the answer is because most men are going to die with prostate cancer rather than from it, because it's if you have what's called a Gleason score of 6 or less, which is a measure of how aggressive the tumor is, you're much more likely to die with it rather than from it. And Peter Carroll, Dr. Carroll, is probably the best surgeon in the country. For if you've got prostate cancer and you have an aggressive tumor, he's the guy to see. But he also has the largest selection of what are called, at the time, watchful waiting, now called active surveillance, monitoring people to see what happens. What we found is, and the advantage of doing, let me say that again. The advantage of this experimental design is we could have men who all have biopsy-proven prostate cancer. Half of them were randomly assigned to get the lifestyle intervention, and half of them weren't. And it's very rare in people with cancer to not have some treatment that they're doing. So now we could actually look at the lifestyle changes effects alone without being confounded with other interventions in the control group. And what we found is that the intervention group, their PSA, prostate-specific antigen, went down, which is a marker for prostate cancer. The control group, the randomized control group, went up or got worse. The differences were highly significant. And they occurred in a dose-response fashion. In other words, the more people changed their lifestyle, the lower their PSA went. But PSA is a good but not a perfect marker for prostate cancer. And so we added some of their blood of the people who went through the study to a standard line of prostate tumor cells growing in tissue culture called a LinCap cell line in Bill Aronson's lab at UCLA. And we found that the tumor growth was inhibited by 70% versus only 9% in the usual care group. So when people make these lifestyle changes, something ends up in their blood that actually inhibits the tumor from growing. And what really blew me away was that inhibition occurred in a dose-response effect as well. In other words, the more people change their lifestyle, the more it actually inhibited the tumor from growing in tissue culture when we added their blood samples to it.
Amazing. So I want to get into what those changes are for people in just a moment, but we're facing an epidemic of dementia and Alzheimer's disease in this country and the world. And there's no cure for it. There's really no drugs for it. There's all sorts of controversy about what's actually causing it. Is it the beta amyloid plaque building up in the brain, or is it something else? Nobody really knows. So you set out to see if this change in diet and stress management and lifestyle would affect Alzheimer's. So tell us about that study, which is your most recent study.
Yeah, and it may be the most important because nothing else works, as you said. There are lots of drugs that just, at best, slow down the rate at which you get worse.
Yeah, an empty bank account.
But getting worse more slowly is still getting worse. So they take your hope away more often than not. And the suicide rate in the month after being diagnosed with Alzheimer's is 7 times higher because, when you lose your memories, you lose everything. And I saw this firsthand with my mom who died of Alzheimer's, who was a genius, was brilliant, and just so heartbreaking and all of her siblings died of it. And I have one of the ApoE4 genes myself. So although this recent test I had said that I was at very low risk, which I was glad to find out. Hope it's true.
Great.
But anyway, that's why I did the study. And so we took men and women who had early stage Alzheimer's, but not so early. These are people who, they couldn't cook because they leave the stove on, or they couldn't read a book because they keep reading the same paragraph over and over again, or watch a movie, or watch a TV show.
You couldn't drive.
They couldn't drive. They couldn't, so they were early, but not that early. And so we randomly assigned them in 2 groups. One group we gave the same lifestyle intervention to that we've cited in all of our other previous research, and the other group had usual care. And then what we found is after just 20 weeks, we used 4 of the standard measures of Alzheimer's disease that are used in the drug trials. And 3 of those 4 measures showed significant improvement. Significant difference was compared to the randomized control group. Whereas in the usual care group, the randomized control group, all 4 of them got worse during that time. The test of those 4 that I thought was that I think is the most clinically relevant is called the Clinical Global Impression of Change score, or CGIC. And the reason I like it is that they not only interview the patient, they also interview the spouse or caregiver, and they really know what's going on with the patient because they're with them all the time. And with that test, we found that after 20 weeks, we found that 71% of the patients stopped or improved their cognition during those 20 weeks. And after 40 weeks, which we're about to publish, we found that 83% of the patients stopped or improved their cognition. And remember, the drugs only slow it down. If they could just stop it, that would be an improvement, but they just get worse more slowly, and not even that much more slowly. We then took the usual care group, who got worse in all 4 measures after, in fact, using that one test after 20 weeks, none of them got better. A third stayed the same, and 2/3 got worse.
These are the people that did not go on your program.
Exactly. So after 20 weeks, we then took the usual care group who got worse, and we gave them the same lifestyle program for 40 weeks. And they started to get better and better in the same way that the usual care. So it just added another level of biological plausibility to our findings. We also measured amyloid, which is called the A-beta 42/40 ratio. And amyloid is a protein that dunks up the brain, kind of short-circuited. And for many years, that was the amyloid hypothesis, as it was called, was thought to be the main mechanism that caused Alzheimer's. So drugs were developed, and they spent billions of dollars developing drugs. Only 3 have been approved in the last 20 years, and all 3 are designed, they're monoclonal antibodies that are designed to move amyloid out of your brain. So the idea was that if amyloid is causing the problem and you can move amyloid out of your brain, then people's thinking should get better. But what they found was that they got worse more slowly. They didn't even stop it, much less get better. In fact, one of the drugs has now been taken off the market, and the other 2 they're very expensive. By the time you pay for the infusion costs and required testing, it's $90,000 to $100,000 per person per year. And yet what we found is that these lifestyle changes also moved amyloid out of the brain through the same A-beta 42/40 ratio. But they're also working on all these other mechanisms that we've been talking about: chronic inflammation, oxidative stress, et cetera, et cetera. And so if the only thing that you're doing is moving amyloid out of the brain, which is what the drugs do, there's a little benefit. It slows it down, but it doesn't even stop or reverse it. But if you're moving amyloid out of the brain, which is what the lifestyle changes also do, and you're affecting all these other mechanisms, that's when we can stop or even improve cognition in the majority of patients.
So would you say from
By the way, we found a dose-response correlation between the degree of lifestyle change and the degree of moving amyloid out of the brain.
Okay. So would you say for a lay person, the more, for example, you eat junk food, the more junk you're going to have in your brain?
That's one way to put it.
I'm not the doctor. Okay, so these results are amazing, and you're showing them across all these different chronic diseases, the scourge of our time, including cancer. So people are asking, okay, what do I need to do? What does it consist of? And of course, the corollary question is, can I do it? Will I be motivated to do it?
Yeah.
So why don't you break down for people, let's say not for the most extreme case, but the basic things that most people can do to avoid and even reverse these diseases. And I know you've published a book called The Spectrum, which refers to if you're really sick, you need to do this, which is more intense.
No, it's the other way around.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, well, you've asked several things, so let me try to parse them out.
Sure.
So first of all, I should probably mention that when we published these findings with heart disease, for example, I thought that would really change medical practice. And to some degree it did, but not as much as I'd like. And then I realized that it's not enough to have good science, you have to have reimbursement. You know, that and again, it's not that doctors are only interested in money, but if you're trained to use drugs and surgery and you're reimbursed to use drugs and surgery, then that's what you use. It's like, if the only tool you have is a hammer and all that. So you see everything is a nail. So I thought, well, let's see if we can get, we first Mutual of Omaha covered it, and Highmark Blue Cross Blue Shield covered it. And
I mean, your program.
My program, right. And Blue Shield of California and Aetna. But I thought if we get Medicare to do it, that would really be the, there's a term, I can't remember anyway. That
the establishment.
No, it's the key to, if Medicare covers it, other people tend to cover, other insurance companies tend to do it as well. And if you change reimbursement, you not only change medical practice, but ultimately medical education. So we went to Medicare. I had no idea it would be so hard. We had the support of Bill Clinton when he was president and Newt Gingrich when he was Speaker of the House. One of the only things that they both supported, I think, maybe the only thing. We had Charlie Rangel, a very liberal Democrat, and Dan Burton, a very conservative Republican. We actually did lifestyle seminars at Congress that they both co-sponsored. I don't know if that would happen today. Things are so much more polarized. But anyway, with all of that, it took 16 years for Medicare to finally cover, for which I'm deeply grateful. And so that really, first they were covering it in hospitals and clinics that we train. Now we've been doing it all virtually through Zoom. So now we can reach people everywhere. They don't have to live near a hospital or clinic we've trained. And so they don't have to take time off for work or get transportation or childcare, whatever. They can just do it from home, which has been a real game changer. Now we've been partnering with a company called Carta Health, so they can help me scale this, because I'm not really a good business person. So
And if people want to join this and learn about it, where should they go?
just go to either ornish.com or cardahealth.com, CARDA. So that's exciting. This has just happened in the last few months. And so having seen what a powerful difference these changes can make, it's wonderful for me to be able to get it out to more people who can benefit from it.
But what can people do on their own to stay healthy and get over some of these chronic diseases?
So
what are the basics of it?
It's not all or nothing. We've learned that, first of all, I've learned that even wanting to be healthy, people want to feel free and in control. I've learned that the hard way by telling people what to do, and it didn't work. And when I lecture, sometimes I joke, this goes back to the first dietary intervention when God said, don't eat the apple, and that didn't go so well, and that was God talking. Not apples are good for you.
Well, the suggestions you're making, not the instructions.
Right. So if you're trying to reverse disease, the reason we were the first to prove that with all these other conditions is it's hard. You have to make really big changes. It's the pound of cure, if you will, as opposed to the ounce of prevention. If you have bad disease, but if you're just trying to stay healthy, it's not all or nothing. The more you change, the more you improve at any age. That's really the bottom line we found in all of our studies. But you decide how much you want to change. So the book I wrote with my wife and co-partner for 29 years, in fact, our 20-year wedding anniversary is coming up in a few weeks, Anne Ornish, is the Undo It book. That's really about undoing or reversing chronic diseases. But the Spectrum book that you mentioned, I wrote earlier, is based on the idea that the more you change, the more you improve. So instead of calling foods good or bad, because once you call foods bad, it's kind of like, the whole language of behavioral change has this kind of moralistic,
game, right?
Nurse Ratched, finger wagging, you're bad. And people hate that.
Nanny state.
Hate that, what's that?
Nanny state.
Yeah, I hate that too. So instead of calling foods good or bad, in the Spectrum book, I categorize foods from the most healthy group 1 to the least healthy group 5 and groups 2 through 4 in the middle, and say, what are you eating now? And so like if I say, David, what do you eat? You come to me and say, I want to be healthier. I'd say, well, why do you want to be healthier? Well, you'd say, well, I want to live longer, right? And I'd say, well, why do you want to live longer? He goes, well, no one's ever asked me that before. Doesn't everybody want to live longer? I'd say, well, no. A lot of people are really depressed. They're just trying to get through the day, And so if you can first get people to have a sense of meaning that's associated with these lifestyle changes, they're much more likely to do it. This goes all the way back to Viktor Frankl's work in concentration camps, when he would interview people, and he found that the people who survived weren't necessarily the strongest or the healthiest, or they were the ones who had the strongest sense of meaning and purpose. I have to survive so that whatever, I can get reunited with my loved ones or bear witness or whatever it had to be. So the first thing I do is say, why do you want to get healthier? Why do you want to live longer? And people, oh, well, gosh, let's see. No one's ever asked me that. I want to watch my kids grow up. I want to dance at their wedding, whatever it happens to be. If you can get them to identify and commit to that internally, then they're much more likely to make lifestyle changes. So the second thing is, I'd say, well, what are you trying to do? What's your goal? You might say, well, I want to get my blood pressure down 10 points, or get my cholesterol down, my LDL down 50 points, or I want to get my blood sugar, my A1C down a point or two, or I just want to think more clearly, or have more energy, or lose weight, lose 10 pounds, whatever it happens to be. Say, great. What are you eating now? Well, I'm eating mostly unhealthy group 5 foods, group 4 and 5,
What are they?
Oh, like, fried cheese and donuts and, processed red meats and things like that. Okay. How much? So group 1 would be your fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes.
Those are the good ones.
Those are good ones. Group 5 are the unhealthy ones.
Ham sandwiches.
And so say, how much are you willing to move towards the healthy end of that spectrum? Well, I don't know. I'll still eat some groups 4 and 5, but I'll eat some of the 1s and 3s, 1 through 3s as well. Okay, great. How much exercise are you getting? Not much. How much are you willing to do? Well, I don't know. I'll walk 20 minutes. I'll walk a half hour a day. Okay, great. How much time are you spending with meditation and yoga and stress management? 0. How much are you willing to do? Oh, I'll meditate 10 minutes twice a day. Okay. How much time are you spending with your friends and family? Not enough. I'll spend more. Okay, great. So We track it, we support it. And, if you indulge yourself one day, it doesn't mean you cheated or you're bad or you failed. Just eat healthier the next. You don't have time to exercise for half an hour, do it for 10 minutes. You don't have time to meditate for 20 minutes, do it for 1 minute. Whatever you do, there's a corresponding benefit. In fact, the consistency is more important than the duration. In fact, I play a little game with myself. Sometimes I'll wake up and I'm like overslept and I don't have time. It's like, I don't have time to meditate this morning. I have to, my little voice goes, you have a minute? And I have to go, oh, guys, if I have to admit that I don't have a minute, then I have to admit my life is so out of balance, I'll just do the minute, And once you do the minute, then you generally will do more. It's just getting started. But even the minute actually has benefit, just to digress a moment. It's kind of like if you ever hear a song on the radio and you find yourself humming it later in the day, it's like that with meditation. It continues subconsciously, even if you're not doing it more than a minute. And then we'll track your changes. So let's say after a month, you wanted to get your LDL down 50 points, it came down 30 points. Say, David, look at this. It came down 30 points. How great. Now, if you just make do a little more exercise, a little more meditation, a little less junk food, a little more time with your friends and family, that'll probably do it. So it takes, you can't fail. It's a much more compassionate approach. Because if you indulge yourself one day, it doesn't mean you cheated or you failed, you're bad, whatever. Just do a little better the next day.
Okay, so that's
much more sustainable.
That's great context for people and psychologically very helpful. I can tell you from experience. But let's examine, there's a protein fad going on among young people today for weight building, et cetera. And the federal government just changed its guidelines to tell people to eat more red meat and more saturated fat and more whole dairy products. So what would your advice to people be? How much, if they're not, I understand that people that are actually very ill have to do a whole different program. But for average people, what do you advise people about how much animal protein they should eat? How much plants should they eat? What's the basic guidance?
Yeah. When you shift from a animal-based diet to a plant-based diet, like I did growing up in Texas, and when I was 19, I made that shift, you get a double benefit. You're not only not eating things that increase your risk of all these different chronic diseases, like red meat, for example, especially processed red meats, but you're getting the plants, fruits and vegetables and whole grains and legumes and soy products and things like that have thousands of substances within them that have anti-cancer, anti-heart disease, anti-aging properties. Phytochemicals, bioflavonoids, carotenoids, retinols, isoflavones, genistein, lycopene, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so you're really getting a double benefit because you're not only not eating the things that make you sick, but you're getting all these protective things as well. So it's really up to you. I never tell people what to do. But to the degree that you can not eat things that are harmful, like red meat and processed red meat, and move towards the healthier end of the spectrum, fruits and vegetables, to the degree that you can, avoid saturated fats, especially trans fats, to the degree that you're going to get plenty of protein from eating a plant-based diet. If you really are concerned about it, you can take plant-based protein supplements, although most people don't need to do them. Rice and beans is a complete protein. It's the same quality protein that you find in red meat, but it's what you're not getting. The animal protein itself, it's not just the saturated fat and the cholesterol and things like that. There's more and more evidence that the animal protein itself is inflammatory. So you're getting the benefit of, whereas plant-based proteins have an anti-inflammatory effect.
And what about fish?
Fish is, if I had to put a spectrum, I'd put processed red meats, then chicken and turkey, and then fish, and then plant-based foods. So being a pescatarian is a lot better than being a carnivore.
And for people who are fond of meat, would you say go to every other day, make sure most of your meals are plant-based and have smaller portions of meat? Would that be advice that you might offer to people who are motivated?
I found there are two basic strategies that are successful in getting people to make and maintain changes. The first is the incremental approach that you just described. Just make gradual changes and, if you, have it on occasion, don't eat too much of it and all that, and that's fine. But the paradox is sometimes it's actually easier to make big changes in a lot of things at the same time, even though that's counterintuitive. The prevailing wisdom is that the more you ask people to do, the less likely they are to do it. In fact, like statins, a third to half the people who are prescribed statins aren't taking them just 3 or 4 months later, even if someone else is paying for them, even if they don't have side effects, even though they're proven value for many patients. So that's just taking a pill once a day. But the reason is that the statins don't make you feel better, and they're fear-based. We don't think about it that way, but it's, David, take this Lipitor, so you don't get a heart attack or a stroke 10 years from now. Well, you don't want to think about getting something bad. I mean, if you've had a heart attack, you'll do pretty much anything for like a month or two, and then you stop because we all know we're going to die. The mortality rate is still 100%. It's one per person. We don't think about it most of the time, but we all know we're going to die. So efforts to try to scare people into changing don't really last, maybe for a short time. But what is sustainable is love and feeling good and pleasure. And the paradox is that because these biological mechanisms are so dynamic, if you only make small changes, you don't really feel that much better. But if you go on a plant-based diet and meditate and exercise and love more, most people are angina. We found a 91% reduction in the frequency of angina within 2 or 3 weeks. Now, if you've got heart disease and angina and you can't walk up the stairs without getting chest pain, you can't make love with your spouse, you can't go back to work, you can't play with your kids without getting pain, and within 3 weeks you can do all those things, people say things like, I like eating junk food, but not that much, because what I gain is so much more than what I give up, and quickly. And yeah, I like eating. And in fact, in our earlier studies, our very first study, we found that all these the patients, their chest pain went away. And then when the study was over, they went out and started picking out, and their chest pain came back.
Yeah.
So it's like a built-in guru, if you will. It's saying, hey, you're not doing something that's in your best interest. But the point is that it's not just chest pain. In the case of Alzheimer's, people begin to think more clearly. Takes a little bit longer, 15 weeks or 20 weeks. Or they lose weight, without having to feel hungry, because it's so much less dense in calories when you eat less fat and less sugar. Or they find that they have more energy. They just, we found the depression scores went down by almost 50%. There's, your food affects your mood, in ways that we fully understand through different neurotransmitters. So the point is that sometimes big changes are easier than small ones, because when you make big changes, you feel so much better so quickly for most people. It reframes the reason for making lifestyle changes from fear of dying or fear of something bad happening, which is not sustainable, to feeling good, which is.
Right. My doctor found that I had higher LDL levels and my blood pressure went up a little bit, and he tried to put me on a statin. And knowing you, I said to him, well, isn't it true that if I cut back on alcohol, eat much, much less or no red meat, exercise and meditate more, that I can bring these things down myself? And the doctor said, it's true, but you won't do it.
Yes.
And I said, the hell with you, of course I'm going to do it. And I did it. And 2 months later, all my labs were back to normal.
There you go.
So it works really fast. Of course, we could do a whole other interview about this, and we won't get into it too much today, but the world is eating more meat.
Yeah.
We're cutting down more forests for more meat consumption. Meat is viewed as a status symbol, a symptom of wealth around the world. So we have a big job to do for human health and the planet to convince people that too much meat is not a good thing.
Well, to go back to your story with your doctor, so much of it becomes self-fulfilling. If the doctor says, look, David, I know you're not going to do it, and why would you want to anyway? Just take the statin, it'll take care of it. Then most patients say, okay, I won't do it. And then they don't see, I knew they couldn't do it.
But then we have the other problem, which is that the food companies are marketing all the time.
Yes.
And the drug companies are marketing all the time. So the culture is signaling to you the opposite of what's actually good for you.
Yes.
Well, what are we going to do about that?
Well, I've worked in different ways. I mean, first of all, let's take what you've described, which is so important, that, more global warming is caused by livestock consumption than all forms of transportation combined. I actually had a discussion with Al Gore about this many years ago, and he became a vegan, not just because of me, but when he looked into the data, he saw that was true. It takes 14 times more resources to make a pound of meat-based protein than plant-based protein. So there's enough protein down to feed the world. No one need go hungry if more people move towards a plant-based diet, not to mention all the water requirements and so on. So when people understand that so often people say, what can I do as one person, to make a difference in the world? There's just so much to do. Something as primal as what we choose to eat every day can free up more food for the hungry, can affect global warming, can help reduce the deforestation in the Amazon, because so much of the Amazon is clear cut to make room for grazing cattle and so on.
Yes, so it's all true. Plus, you feel better if you make these changes.
Yeah, exactly.
You'll live more healthy. You'll suffer less. Your joints won't hurt as you get older as much. And this is,
And your sexual potency.
oh yeah, that's
later in
too.
life.
So you've tried to work with food companies.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit about that.
Years ago, I worked with the CEO of McDonald's to get um, veggie burgers on the menu, which they did. And they actually came up with these great salads. They had 14 different kinds of edamame and lettuce and all these things. But it turned out it didn't work so well because the burger was subsidized, but the healthy foods were not.
Mm.
So the salad was $5.99, the burger's 99 cents. So if you're on a fixed income, which a lot of people eat at McDonald's are, you get a lot more for your money, at least from a calorie standpoint, by eating junk food, which was sad. I worked with them to reduce the sodium in the French fries, which they never talked about because they were afraid that that would be self-fulfilling and people actually like them better. We got them to change from beef tallow to healthy oils to fry the French fries in. So I just figured incremental change on that scale of 43 million customers a day would have benefit, which it did, but not as much as I'd hoped. I worked with the CEO of PepsiCo to try to get them to make healthier versions of their foods, like baked Doritos and baked tostados instead of frieds, and some foods that had healthier vegetables baked into them. Not the optimal way. We know that processed foods are can really be harmful, but some processed foods, if done properly, it can be a trade-off. And I thought, if they could really use their advertising and promotion to motivate people to make healthier behaviors, that would be a good thing. And to some degree they did, but not nearly as much as I'd hoped. So I stopped doing that many years ago.
So what do you think of the MAHA movement, the moms pushing for healthier food and teaching conservatives to eat healthier and to push against chemicals in food? What's your view of that?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of the MAHA principles are ones that I've been advocating for decades. Eat real food. Eat food that's avoid chemicals, avoid additives, avoid processed foods. The idea, unfortunately, that meat is good for you or whole milk is good for you or beef tallow is good for you is unfortunately not true. But overall, I think the general idea of moving towards getting away from just drugs and surgery as the sole ways of determining our health is a good one.
Yeah, I don't understand why Bobby Kennedy pushes all that meat and beef tallow. And, I guess he thinks it's manly and high testosterone or something.
Can't really
The scientific evidence is against him, as it is on vaccines, of course, in most cases. So what about there's clearly an increase going on in colon cancer in young people. There's also an increase in mental health problems in young people. So what's your view of the likely causes and solutions to that?
Well, unfortunately, intimacy is healing, but social media is not a real form of intimacy. And what makes intimacy healing is that when you grow up in a neighborhood with 2 or 3 generations of people like I did, or you are a member of a church or synagogue or mosque or club or something where you spend time with people, or even if you're at a job with people for 10 years or more, you really get to know them, and you don't just know their good stuff, when they messed up, like in my neighborhood, when one guy got busted or one guy they threw that rock through the window and another guy got, expelled from school or whatever, but the neighborhood coalesced around them, they're still there for you. It's like, I see you, like an avatar, or which is really an old African proverb. I see all of you, not just your good stuff, and I'm still there for you. In our support groups, we create a place to try to replicate that feels safe enough for people to talk openly and authentically about what's really going on in their lives without fear that someone's going to judge them or criticize them or reject them or, give them glib advice on how to fix it. They just listen, and somebody can say, gosh, may look like the perfect dad, but my kid's having all kinds of problems at school. And somebody else says, hey, my kid's having problems too, or I'm having problems or whatever. And it doesn't fix the fact that these people are having problems, but it fixes the shame and the isolation around them. Whereas in social media, it looks like everybody has this perfect life but you. Here's my kid graduating, and here we are in front of the Louvre, and here we are, and whatever. And so it's not a real authentic.
It's draining and competitive by nature.
That's right. And especially when you add to that bullying and all the other things that kids are having to deal with these days, it's toxic. And so it's unfortunate that our kids are having a much harder time than we did.
But that's on the mental health side, although certainly you could argue that the quality of so much of the junk food diet contributes to lack of the right phytonutrients for your brain and the right kinds of fatty tissues. But what about the increase in colon cancer? Do you have any theories about what this could be? I mean, do we have increased processed meat consumption happening in young people? Is it about the same? What do you think is happening?
Well, it's not just colon cancer. So many chronic diseases are increasing in young people. And it's the same issue. People are eating unhealthy diets. They're eating way too much red meat and processed meat, processed foods in general. They're not exercising. If you look at the CDC maps of obesity over the last 30 years, it looks like we're being taken over by an alien force. The obesity rates just keep climbing. And so it's not hard to figure out what the problem is. The real question is, how can we help empower our kids? I mean, my kids, like reading labels. They would kind of like teach them. Now they don't always do that. They like junk food as much as anybody does. But at least that, to me, awareness is always the first step in both motivation and in healing. And I think that's especially true for young kids.
Okay, so let's talk in the time we have
And
left.
by the way, the other thing that has been found to work really well with young kids is teaching them how they are being manipulated by advertising, by the media, to make unhealthy choices. And if they can really understand that, then they go, oh, I don't want anybody controlling me like that.
Well, that's how we got tobacco smoking down in young people, is showing them that they were being purposely addicted by these evil companies. That actually worked more than the health stuff.
Yes, because when you're young, you don't think of you're ever going to die. You think you're immortal.
So speaking of awareness, your awareness was greatly affected by meeting this Indian healer, yoga master, Swami Satchidananda. And I like the story that you tell that he was asked if he was a Hindu, and he said, no, I'm an undo. I'm going to teach people how to undo all the things that are hurting them and causing bad health and problems for society. So tell us briefly, how did you meet him and what did he do to you?
What did he do to me? I don't know. I can say what he did for me. It's a long story, but I'll give you the short version. I almost committed suicide when I was 19. I was at Rice University in Houston, and I felt like I was stupid, that I had just managed to fool the admissions committee, that I was a smart person. What's now called the imposter syndrome. I had an organic chemistry professor who I was convinced had come there to torture me, and he said on the first day of class, look to your right and look to your left, and one of you won't be here at the end of the semester. It was this is a weed out course. I'm going to weed you out. And these are, at Rice, half the class graduated first or second in their high school. So putting everybody under a curve was, not good. And I also had this spiritual vision that nothing could bring lasting happiness. And so the combination of feeling like I was never going to amount to anything because I was stupid, and even if I did, it wouldn't matter. I thought, well, why don't I just kill myself? Dead people look like they're peaceful, and I couldn't even sit down. I was so agitated. I actually went through a week straight without even being able to sleep because I was so agitated, which itself will make you crazy. And so I was all set to do that. And I got so run down that I got this really bad case of mononucleosis where I literally couldn't get out of bed, which saved my life. And my parents got wind that I was doing badly. They saw what a wreck I was. So they pulled me out of school and took me home to Dallas. And my plan was to, as crazy as this sounds, was to get well enough to kill myself because I didn't even have the energy to get out of bed at the time. Meanwhile, this was in 1973 in January. Meanwhile, my older sister had been kind of a child of the 60s, and she had studied with Swami Satchidananda, and it really helped her get grounded. So when he came to Dallas to give a lecture, my parents decided to have a cocktail party for the Swami, which was really weird in
Texas.
in 1973. And so in walks this central castings idea what a Swami should look like, with a long white beard and long flowing saffron robes. And, there's an old saying that when the student is ready, the teacher appears, and that was certainly true for me. So he gave a lecture, a satsang in our living room, and he started off by saying, nothing can bring you lasting happiness, which I'd already figured out, except I was ready to do myself in, and he's glowing. I'm like, what am I missing here? And he went on to say what really turned my life around, which to many people may sound like a new age cliche, but it was really powerful to me at the time, which is that nothing can bring you lasting happiness, but you have it already if you don't disturb it. And this is what we began this conversation with. And so the goal of all these different practices is to stop us from disturbing the inner peace and health and well-being that is already there. So I thought, that sounds interesting because first of all, I felt validated because everybody said, of course, things will make you happy. Just get married and rich and famous and all this stuff and you'll be happy. And I knew that wasn't true. So I felt validated and I thought, okay, this is kind of a weird, interesting guy. Let me try this. I'll move killing myself down to plan B. I'll try this, first. So I began making these changes, and I had grown up in Texas eating, meat 3 or 4 or 5 times a day, and chilies and cheeseburgers and chalupas and everything.
And
And
he asked you to be a
he
vegetarian?
said, just do all the things. You'd be a vegetarian, do meditation, get some exercise, and learn to love yourself and love other people. And so I got glimpses of what that was, and they became more than just glimpses, and I kind of got grounded in that. So then I went back to school. I transferred to the University of Texas in Austin and became a humanities major and, gave the baccalaureate. And I say that not to brag, but to say I experienced both ends of that spectrum. One, I felt like a total failure, totally stupid. And the other, was at the pinnacle of success. And it wasn't because anything external changed, it all changed from within me. And so for me, my doorway to transformation was suicidal depression. For other people, it could be having a heart attack or Alzheimer's or prostate cancer or whatever. And so for me, the opportunity that I wasn't trained in when I was going through medical school was to use the experience of suffering as a doorway for transformation because change is hard. But if you're in enough pain and someone says, if you make these changes, your pain will be less, then that gets your attention. And there's a motivational moment when someone is first diagnosed with having a heart attack or, in my case, depression or something else that we don't usually take advantage of. And so what I call my work and what my wife and I call our work is a conspiracy of love, that we can work with people who are suffering and show them how they can use that as a catalyst for transforming their lives in ways that make them so much more joyful and happier and peaceful, but not just for that reason, but because that's ultimately what gives us a sense of meaning in our lives. And then we can use that meaning to do good work in the world. But what for me is like people say, oh, should I be selfish or unselfish? Like, well, it's both because I learned I could take all the meaning out of my life. When I was depressed, that was part of the issue. Who cares? So what? Big deal. Nothing matters. Why bother? Usual kind of existential angst, except for me, it was a lot worse than usual. But I also learned that I could imbue my life with meaning. This is one of the most powerful lessons I learned from the Swami. He said that acts of service imbue your life with meaning. And so it's ultimately the most selfish thing you can do is to do acts of service, to forgive yourself, to love compassion and love other people, because that is what frees us from our suffering right here and right now.
And then you can spread it to others.
So you can spread it to others, which is, again, the conspiracy of love.
So in the just couple of minutes we have left, part of your service has been to help several American presidents with their health and lifestyle. How did that go?
Well, I was asked to work with Bill Clinton when he was president, and then later I was appointed to White House commissions by both President Clinton and by President Obama, and consulted with President Biden. Um, uh, it was a great opportunity to. First of all, I really enjoyed the time that I spent with all three of them. They're amazing people. Whatever your politics are, I think when a president of the United States decides to eat and live more healthfully, that sets a great example for everybody. And so I was asked to work with him, and I helped train the White House chefs to cook for him at the White House, and then on Air Force One and the Navy mess. And then when his bypasses clogged up, he got really serious about going on the diet, and he's still doing it, pretty much, and has done really well since then. So again, I feel very grateful for the opportunity to have been of service in such a meaningful way.
And you've helped many people in Silicon Valley. You were close to Steve Jobs. And so tell us what you can about that relationship.
Well, Steve and I became close friends. He was one of my closest friends for almost 25 years. I met him when years ago when his wife Laureate was doing a vegan food company called Terra Vera, and they asked me to consult with them. And he was kind of in between Next and Apple, and we just became close friends. I think because we were in such different worlds, that made it a lot easier. And I loved him. I really missed Steve. And then when he got sick, there was a lot of misconception around that. People thought I was the one who told him not to have conventional treatment, but it was just the opposite. But he really thought that lifestyle could. It's a longer story than we have time for now, but let me just say that I love Steve and miss him terribly, and Marina and I have remained close.
Yeah. Well, great. Well, thank you so much, Dean, for being on the Fenton Forecast and for all the work you've done to help make a better humanity and a better world.
Thank
And I hope that that this interview helps more people see what they can do if they want to learn more of specifically about how they can do this. You've published how many books now?
I've published 7 books. The most recent is called Undo It. If you go to ornish.com or to cardahealth.com, these are also great resources for you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Brother Dean.
Great to see you. Thank you.
Okay.